The Aral Sea is gone. Not faded, not eroded. Gone like a continent erased, like a map ripped apart and redrawn in silence. Once the fourth largest lake on Earth, its waters fed empires, cooled deserts, birthed cities along its shore. And then, within a single human lifetime, it withered into dust. Imagine what would happen if the beating heart of a region were cut open and left to bleed into the sand. That is no metaphor. It happened. In the 1960s, Moscow carved rivers with steel and fire, chaining the Amu Darya and Sir Darya to feed fields of cotton. White gold, they called it. A harvest worth more than seas, more than nations, more than life itself. And the water obeyed. It was stolen, diverted, consumed, while the Aral shrank into a wound visible from space. What if it happened that an inland ocean became a desert graveyard? Its fishing fleets stranded miles from shore, its seabed turned into a toxic storm. Salt, chemicals, the ghosts of rivers, all rising into the air, carried across Central Asia like a curse. Maps changed, climates shifted, a world vanished, and no one stopped it. The question is not how. It is why no one screamed louder. It stood once as an inland ocean, a colossal body of water stretched across the heart of Central Asia, shimmering in the barren steppe, a lake so vast that to those who lived along its shores, it felt eternal. The Aral Sea, by the mid-20th century, the world's fourth largest lake, occupied a basin between the deserts of Kazakhstan to the north and Uzbekistan to the south. Its waters spread over an area of more than 68,000 square kilometers. The name itself, Aral, drawn from the local Turkic word for island, carried meaning. More than 1,000 islands dotted its surface, turning the sea into a labyrinth of water and land. It was no ordinary lake. It was a continent's core, a regulator of life, climate, and trade. The geography defined its power. Two rivers, each ancient in their own right, poured life into it. From the east came the Sir Darya, flowing 2,200 kilometers from the Tian Shan Mountains through the Kazakh steppe. From the south came the Amu Darya, older than history itself, once known to the Greeks as the Oxus. It originated in the Pamir and Hindu Kush ranges, coursing more than 2,500 kilometers across deserts and oases before emptying into the Aral. Without these rivers, the sea would not exist. With them, it sustained entire civilizations. Their floods carried silt and nutrients, creating fertile deltas where reeds grew thick, fish spawned in abundance, and human settlements thrived. For centuries, this sea shaped the rhythm of life. The fishing industry along its shores was more than sustenance. It was identity, livelihood, and trade. By the late 19th century, Russian imperial surveys recorded a fishing fleet of more than 20,000 tons annually, with sturgeon, carp, pike, and sazan pulled from the waters. Fish from the Aral supplied markets as far as Moscow. In towns like Aralsk in the north and Moynak in the south, smoke from canneries rose above the horizon, their tin-packed fish exported along the railway lines that linked Central Asia to Russia's industrial centers. To live by the Aral was to be tied to water that seemed endless, a liquid wealth that supported tens of thousands of families. The cultural memory of the sea reached deeper still. For Kazakh nomads moving through the northern steppe, its shores provided grazing lands and refuge. For Uzbek farmers in the south, its waters fed canals that sustained fields of grain and orchards. Archaeology shows that settlements along the Amu Darya Delta date back to the Achaemenid Empire of the 6th century BCE, when Persians and later Alexander the Great's armies sought to control this water frontier. Cities rose and fell on its banks, from Khiva to Khwarezm, their fortunes tied to the flow of rivers that ultimately swelled the Aral. It did more than feed mouths or economies. It dictated the climate of a region otherwise dominated by arid deserts. In summer, the vast body of water cooled the air, moderating temperatures that otherwise would have scorched the land. In winter, it released warmth, softening the bite of continental cold. The sea's evaporation fed clouds, creating localized rainfall that nourished reeds, wetlands, and the intricate web of life stretching across Central Asia's flat horizon. Birds migrated across its surface, using its islands as stepping stones. Mammals roamed its shores. The balance was fragile, yet for millennia it endured, because the rivers continued their course unbroken. When Russian scientists first charted it in detail during the 19th century, they marveled at its scale. The 1850s maps showed an inland sea sprawling so far across the desert that it seemed an error of geography. They measured depths reaching 69 meters, recorded a shoreline longer than 4,400 kilometers, and noted the extraordinary number of islands. To the Russian Empire, it became a frontier for expansion, a place to extend railroads and test the boundaries of empire. To the people who lived around it, it remained what it had always been, the foundation of survival. By the early 20th century, under Soviet rule, the sea's presence defined Central Asia's economic promise. Fishing fleets multiplied, new canneries opened, and by 1940 the Aral was supplying a sixth of all fish consumed in the Soviet Union. In Moynak, once a sleepy fishing village, trawlers lined the harbor, their crews preparing for voyages across the waves. Children grew up with the sight of ships anchored at the horizon, and families measured time by the rhythm of the catch. It was the certainty of water in the desert. Few questioned its permanence. But permanence was an illusion. The same rivers that filled the Aral had always been contested. From antiquity, rulers fought over the Amu Darya's course, which in certain epochs shifted between the Aral and the Caspian basins. Medieval chroniclers described attempts to redirect its flow to feed rival empires. Yet never before had human intervention reached such scale as what the mid-20th century would bring. Before that rupture, the Aral still held fast, immense and commanding, appearing to the eye as if no force could empty it. What would it mean for a region if its inland ocean ceased to exist? What if it happened that a lake covering an expanse larger than Ireland could be made to vanish, not by natural catastrophe, but by deliberate policy? To those who stood along its shores in 1960, such a question would have sounded impossible, even absurd. The sea spread before them as it always had, vast, unbroken, carrying fleets across its surface, its winds humid, its waters life itself. The thought that this immensity could vanish within a generation was inconceivable. And yet the fragility was there, hidden in plain sight. The Aral Sea depended entirely on the annual inflow of the Syr Darya and Amu Darya. Without those rivers, its evaporation outpaced replenishment. A balance so colossal in appearance was in truth knife-thin. A shift in water usage upstream could tip it. In the 1950s, that shift began. Still before its fall, the Aral was memory preserved in geography. Old photographs capture fishermen standing beside nets straining with hundreds of kilos of catch. Soviet geographers wrote of a blue sea in the desert, a phrase that carried both awe and ambition. Steamships cut across its surface, their whistles echoing across the empty steppe. For the people of Aralsk, Moynak, and the countless villages clustered near the deltas, it was not only geography. It was identity, security, and certainty. The Aral Sea, as it existed in the mid-20th century, was more than water. It was a cradle of civilizations, a regulator of climates, an artery of economies, a canvas for empire, and a refuge for life in one of the harshest regions on Earth. To understand its disappearance, one must first stand at its shore when it still breathed as an ocean, stretching to the horizon, holding the past and future of Central Asia within its restless waves. The Soviet Union looked at the deserts of Central Asia and saw not desolation, but opportunity. To Moscow's planners, the endless steppe and the river valleys of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan were not barren. They were fields waiting to be tamed, transformed into a machine of production. The Aral Sea stood at the center of this geography, fed by the Amu Darya and Syr Darya, rivers whose waters had nourished civilizations for millennia. To Soviet engineers, these rivers were not sacred lifelines. They were resources, reservoirs of power that could be bent, diverted, and harnessed for the will of the state. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union was obsessed with grand projects, colossal schemes designed to bend nature to ideology. Nikita Khrushchev, who rose to power after Stalin's death in 1953, believed the USSR could conquer food shortages and rival the agricultural dominance of the West through sheer scale. His Virgin Lands campaign, launched in 1954, was the beginning. Millions of hectares in Kazakhstan, Siberia, and the Volga steppe were plowed for wheat. Youth brigades, Komsomol volunteers, and soldiers turned farmers flooded into the frontier. At first, it was wheat in the north. Soon, attention shifted south. Cotton, the white gold of Central Asia, became the obsession. Cotton was not new to the region. It had been grown for centuries, but never on the scale that Moscow demanded. Under Khrushchev's vision, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan would be remade into the empire's cotton heartland. Moscow's textile mills relied on imports from abroad, and Soviet leaders despised the dependence. Cotton meant clothing, uniforms, industry, and, crucially, foreign currency. If the USSR could flood its own markets with domestically grown cotton, it would not only meet its needs, but also project power through exports. The plan was audacious. Turn rivers into tools, deserts into fields, and peasants into soldiers of agricultural conquest. To achieve it, the state turned to irrigation. The Syr Darya and Amu Darya, once ending in the Aral Sea, were seen as untapped potential. Beginning in the late 1950s, Soviet engineers began carving canals into the desert on a scale the world had never witnessed. The Karakum Canal, begun in 1954 in Turkmenistan, stretched more than 1,300 kilometers, one of the longest irrigation canals in the world, diverting the Amu Darya's waters into cotton and rice fields. In Uzbekistan, entire networks of ditches and pumping stations redirected the Syr Darya. Engineers cut across deserts with excavators, concrete, and steel, channeling water that had flowed for millennia into an inland sea, now to be spread across endless cotton fields. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Fields that had never seen steady water before now produced harvests of cotton, rice, and wheat. Soviet propaganda boasted of miracles. Deserts blooming with white fields of cotton, villages enriched by the labor of peasants turned collective farm workers. Production statistics soared. By the early 1960s, Uzbekistan supplied more than 70% of Soviet cotton, a staggering achievement that turned the republic into the backbone of the USSR's textile industry. The slogan "Cotton is white gold" became literal policy, and every drop of water was redirected to serve it. But such success was built on theft from the Aral itself. Every cubic meter of water diverted into the Karakum Canal, or Uzbek cotton fields, was a cubic meter denied to the sea. Engineers knew this, but it did not matter. Khrushchev demanded numbers. Quotas fulfilled, hectares expanded, tonnage delivered. The state reported record harvests, entire villages were mobilized for picking campaigns, and even school children were marched into the fields during autumn to gather cotton by hand. The economy was remade around a single crop, and Moscow declared victory. Rice followed cotton, requiring even more water. In parts of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, rice paddies spread across landscapes that had once been semi-arid, demanding vast irrigation that bled the rivers dry. In Kazakhstan, similar efforts extended to wheat, though less dependent on irrigation. The balance of Central Asia shifted. Canals carried not only water, but also pesticides and fertilizers, pouring chemicals into fields with little regard for the consequences. For the state, only immediate results mattered. The transformation was celebrated in official reports, yet even in those years, scientists began to warn of consequences. Hydrologists in the late 1950s and early 1960s measured reduced inflows into the Aral Sea, sounding alarms that the level of the inland ocean was beginning to fall. But Soviet planning treated rivers as expendable, the sea itself as irrelevant. The goal was production, self-sufficiency at any cost. By 1960, the scale of diversion was enormous. The Amu Darya, once a mighty river pouring into the Aral, had large sections siphoned into canals before reaching its delta. The Syr Darya, likewise, was interrupted by dams and diversions that redirected its flow into farmland. Together, They delivered far less water to the sea than they had for centuries. The reduction was measurable, yet ignored. To Moscow, the harvests proved the system worked. By the mid-1960s, cotton output had doubled compared to the pre-war era. Uzbekistan was locked into monoculture. Entire local economies became dependent on the single crop, and farmers were left with no choice but to comply with state quotas. What if it happened that in chasing cotton, a state was willing to sacrifice an entire sea? What would it mean to rob an inland ocean to dress soldiers in uniforms, to clothe cities, to produce hard currency? The Soviet Union did not ask. The ideology of control demanded obedience from both people and nature. Canals stretched like scars across the desert, carrying away the life of the Aral. The scale of engineering astonished the world. The Karakum Canal diverted nearly 50% of the Amu Darya's water. By the early 1970s, more than 20,000 kilometers of canals and irrigation channels crisscrossed Central Asia, carrying water into cotton fields that never stopped expanding. The ambition seemed limitless. Khrushchev himself declared that Central Asia would be the cotton California of the Soviet Union, capable of rivaling the American South. But even as production peaked, the sea was shrinking. Shorelines receded, fishing fleets found themselves traveling farther, and scientists recorded rising salinity. Yet quotas grew harsher, and demands intensified. Cotton became not just an economic asset, but a political instrument, binding Uzbekistan to Moscow through dependency. In 1966, after a massive earthquake struck Tashkent, the rebuilding of the city was funded partly through revenues extracted from the cotton economy. Every hectare mattered. Every drop of water accounted for in reports sent north to Moscow. The obsession continued long after Khrushchev's fall in 1964. Brezhnev's years cemented cotton as the unchallenged priority of Central Asia. Corruption spread through the cotton mafia, local elites falsifying harvest numbers, while irrigation projects consumed ever more water. The Amu Darya and Sir Darya became shadows of themselves, their natural flow strangled by canals, pumps, and diversions. By the late 1960s, the Aral Sea's level had already begun its catastrophic descent, a process that no one in Moscow could claim they had not foreseen. What if it happened that a policy meant to feed a superpower instead sowed the seeds of ecological ruin? The 1950s and 1960s were years of triumph for Soviet cotton. Triumph written in numbers, in harvests, in production figures that dazzled officials and kept factories humming. Yet those same years marked the beginning of the end for one of the world's greatest lakes. Every ton of cotton carried with it a silent cost measured not in rubles, but in meters of water lost, in rivers drained, in a sea condemned to vanish. By the dawn of the 1960s, the Aral Sea still stretched wide across Central Asia, its waves licking the shores of Moynak in the south and Aralsk in the north. But beneath the surface of that expanse, change was already underway, slow, almost invisible at first, but undeniable to those who lived by its waters. The Soviet irrigation schemes, launched with triumphal slogans in the 1950s, had begun to bleed the sea. The Amu Darya and Sir Darya, once mighty rivers feeding its body, were no longer reaching it with the force of centuries. Water was being siphoned into cotton and rice fields, poured across the deserts of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan in the name of white gold. By 1960, the inflow of fresh water had already been cut almost in half. The first warnings came from the people who depended on the sea. Fishermen in Aralsk reported longer journeys to reach the fishing grounds. In Moynak, ships that once docked at the town's edge now had to anchor farther away. Nets came up lighter. Species that had filled markets for generations began to thin. The water tasted sharper, salter. Men who had lived their entire lives by the sea muttered that something was wrong. They could not yet measure it, but they could feel it. Scientists confirmed their fears. Hydrologists studying the sea in the early 1960s noted that the water level, stable for centuries, was falling by about 20 centimeters per year. Salinity, which had once hovered around 10 grams per liter, began to rise steadily. The balance of the ecosystem was shifting. By 1965, reports circulated in scientific institutes that if diversion continued, the Aral could shrink dramatically within decades. Soviet researchers in Tashkent and Moscow wrote memoranda urging limits on irrigation, warning that the inland ocean could not survive unchecked expansion of cotton cultivation. But their warnings clashed with the demands of the state. The cotton economy was booming. In 1960, Uzbekistan produced 4 million tons of raw cotton. By 1970, it was producing nearly double that figure. Each harvest was trumpeted in Pravda as evidence of the Soviet Union's agricultural triumph. Quotas were raised, fields expanded, and canals widened. The voices of caution were buried under the weight of production reports and propaganda. Officials did not want to hear of a dying sea. They wanted tonnage, graphs, and figures that proved the system worked. Still, the evidence was undeniable to anyone who looked. By 1970, the Aral Sea had shrunk by more than 10% of its volume. Its shoreline receded by kilometers. Islands that once lay scattered within its waters grew larger as the sea retreated, and new stretches of seabed, cracked and salt-encrusted, emerged where water had been. Satellite photographs, first taken in the late 1960s, provided visual proof of the retreat, but such images were classified, hidden from the public. The official story remained one of progress. The ecological cost was devastating. Rising salinity killed species that had sustained the fishing industry. By the early 1970s, the Aral had lost much of its sturgeon population. The valuable carp and pike declined, replaced by salt-tolerant species of lesser value. Canneries in Aralsk and Moynak struggled to meet quotas. Their workers laid off or reassigned. Ships sat idle at harbors, their paint peeling as the shoreline pulled away. What had been a thriving industry employing more than 40,000 people collapsed within a single decade. Local communities bore the brunt. In Moynak, once described as a Soviet Riviera of the desert, residents began to leave. Dust storms carried salt from the newly exposed seabed into the town, coating houses, contaminating water, and choking fields. In Aralsk, unemployment spread as fishermen lost their livelihoods. Entire families migrated inland, abandoning the sea that had sustained their ancestors for generations. What would it mean for a culture, for an economy, when the center of its life simply receded into the sand? What if it happened that a town built as a port stood suddenly stranded miles from the water? Even within the Soviet system, some scientists pushed harder. In 1964, a commission led by prominent hydrologists submitted a report to Moscow proposing alternative strategies, such as reducing water-intensive rice cultivation, modernizing irrigation systems, and planting less thirsty crops. They warned that without intervention, the Aral Sea could lose half its size within decades. Their proposals were shelved. Cotton quotas were untouchable. Moscow was unwilling to cut production, and local elites in Uzbekistan relied on cotton revenues to maintain political favor. By the mid-1970s, the situation had worsened dramatically. The sea's surface area had already shrunk by nearly 20%, and salinity had doubled. The once unified body of water began to fracture into northern and southern basins, though still tenuously connected. Fish species collapsed further. In 1974, the last commercial catch of sturgeon was recorded. By 1976, the annual fish catch, once exceeding 40,000 tons, fell below 1,000 tons, effectively signaling the death of the industry. The contrast was brutal. Cotton production surged to record highs, feeding Soviet textile factories and exports. Newspapers hailed Uzbekistan as the jewel of the agricultural system. But the seashells of dead fish littered the exposed seabed where children once swam. Salt storms blew across villages, blinding eyes and stinging lungs. Soviet officials praised success in Moscow, while silence settled over the ports of the Aral. To those living through it, the collapse was not abstract. Farmers in the Amu Darya Delta reported canals clogging with silt, fields poisoned by salinization, crops failing despite the water poured onto them. The very irrigation that had been the engine of the cotton boom was degrading the soil it was meant to enrich. fields white with salt lay abandoned even as the state demanded more land for cotton. In the scientific community, despair spread. Reports written in the late 1970s documented salinity levels rising above 20 grams per liter, approaching thresholds that few freshwater species could tolerate. Predictions grew grim. Within a generation, the Aral could be unsustainable for life. Some suggested radical measures, even diverting Siberian rivers south to refill the basin. Such proposals were fantastical, but they reflected the panic of experts watching a sea vanish before their eyes. The people of Central Asia continued to live between two realities. One was the official narrative of progress, cotton quotas fulfilled, cities prospering, the desert tamed. The other was the daily experience of dust storms, declining water, stranded ships, and poisoned soil. Between these two worlds lay silence, enforced by the state. To speak too loudly of the dying sea was to risk career, reputation, or worse. What if it happened that one of the largest lakes on Earth could shrink, collapse, and die in less than a lifetime, and the world was told instead of victories in agriculture? The 1960s and 1970s were the decades of first decline, the years when the warnings were sounded, when fishermen saw the horizon receding, when scientists measured catastrophe in centimeters per year. It was the beginning of a vanishing that could not be stopped, yet was denied, ignored, and buried under the cotton that consumed the rivers, the fields, and ultimately the sea itself. By the 1980s, the Aral Sea was no longer the inland ocean of memory. It was shrinking at a pace no one could deny. The shoreline retreated kilometer by kilometer each year, leaving skeletal ships stranded in the sand. Port cities like Aralsk in Kazakhstan and Moynak in Uzbekistan, once bustling with canneries, shipyards, and fishermen's markets, found themselves abandoned by the very sea that had created them. Aralsk, once a hub where Soviet steamships carried tens of thousands of tons of fish each season, now sat more than 60 kilometers from the water's edge. Moynak, once called the Pearl of the Aral, was transformed into a desert settlement where fishing fleets rusted under the sun, their hulls half buried in salt. The collapse of the fishing industry was complete. By 1982, catches had fallen so drastically that state quotas were meaningless. Factories shut their doors. Generations of fishermen, whose families had drawn livelihoods from these waters for centuries, were left with nothing. The Aral, which had supplied up to 40,000 tons of fish annually in the 1950s, yielded virtually none by the mid-1980s. Attempts to introduce salt-tolerant species failed as salinity soared beyond 30 grams per liter, levels that extinguished nearly all freshwater life. By the early 1990s, more than 20 native fish species had vanished from the basin. The consequences radiated far beyond the ports. As the sea contracted, it exposed vast stretches of seabed, tens of thousands of square kilometers once hidden beneath water. This new desert was not clean sand, but a poisoned crust of salt and chemicals, the residue of decades of pesticide and fertilizer-laden irrigation runoff. When winds swept across the plains, they lifted this toxic dust into the sky. Salt storms became a seasonal scourge, carrying arsenic, DDT, and other residues across hundreds of kilometers. Farmers in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan reported their crops coated in a white powder that stunted growth. The dust reached as far as the Pamir Mountains, and traces were even recorded in the glaciers of the Himalayas. For local populations, the health toll was relentless. Respiratory illnesses soared, with cases of chronic bronchitis, asthma, and throat cancers recorded at levels far above the Soviet average. Children suffered disproportionately. In Karakalpakstan, the region surrounding the southern Aral, infant mortality rates rose to some of the highest in the Soviet Union. Contaminated drinking water, once filtered naturally by the sea and river systems, now carried salts and toxins at levels unsafe for human consumption. The collapse of the Aral was not only ecological, it was biological, etched into the lungs, stomachs, and bloodstreams of those who lived around its receding shores. Biodiversity collapsed alongside human health. The wetlands that once fringed the Amu Darya and Sir Darya deltas dried out, destroying habitats for migratory birds that had used the Aral Basin as a stopover on routes between Siberia and South Asia. Populations of pelicans, flamingos, and ducks plummeted. Saiga antelope, once grazing in the rich grasslands around the northern shore, vanished as the ecosystem disintegrated. Even the climate shifted. Without the vast body of water to moderate temperatures, summers grew hotter and winters colder. The growing season shortened, rainfall diminished, and desertification spread outward in all directions. By the late 1980s, the transformation of the Aral Sea was visible from space. Soviet satellites captured images of a once unified body breaking apart. The northern basin, closest to Kazakhstan, shrank away from the southern expanse in Uzbekistan. What had been a single sea split into two distinct bodies of water, the North Aral Sea and the South Aral Sea. The connection between them thinned into a narrow strait before collapsing entirely in 1989. From then on, they were separate, each shrinking at its own pace, each a reminder of what had been lost. The North Aral, shallower and smaller, fared slightly better, though it too receded. The South Aral, far larger, faced rapid decline. By the early 1990s, it had split again into eastern and western lobes, the eastern lobe shrinking seasonally until it became little more than a salt flat in summer. The sea that had once been the fourth largest on Earth was fragmenting before human eyes, collapsing into disconnected puddles of history. Even in these years, Soviet authorities tried to silence the catastrophe. Official media minimized the crisis, framing it as a temporary inconvenience rather than a systemic collapse. Yet photographs of rusting ships marooned in sand near Moynak circulated quietly, becoming symbols of a disaster that could not be hidden. International scientists who visited in the late 1980s described the scene as apocalyptic. Villages surrounded by dust, children coughing in clouds of salt, fish canneries turned into ghost factories. The contrast between propaganda and reality widened until denial was impossible. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 only accelerated the disaster. Independent Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan inherited not only the sea's remains, but also the irrigation networks that had caused its death. With Moscow's control gone, cooperation between republics fractured. Each state pursued its own water policies, prioritizing national survival over regional recovery. Uzbekistan clung to cotton, its main export, while Kazakhstan faced the devastation of Aralsk and the empty northern basin. International organizations arrived with promises of aid, but the collapse was already too advanced to reverse on a large scale. By 1995, the Aral had lost more than 75% of its original volume. Its shorelines had receded by hundreds of kilometers in some places. Where Soviet maps once marked blue expanses, new deserts stretched outward, dotted with rusted ships and salt dunes. The fishing ports of the past stood like monuments to a vanished world. Moynak, a former city of 40,000 reduced to fewer than 10,000 residents, its harbor a graveyard of trawlers swallowed by sand. What if it happened that a sea, a living ecosystem supporting millions of lives, could be erased within 3 decades? What if it happened that progress measured in tons of cotton came at the price of annihilation measured in cubic kilometers of water? The Aral's collapse in the 1980s and 1990s was not a natural disaster. It was deliberate, engineered, calculated through canals and quotas, carried out with full knowledge of the warnings that had been ignored. The ecosystem was broken, its rivers strangled, its species erased, its people left to inhale the dust of what once had been an ocean in the desert. The disappearance of the Aral Sea was not only the loss of water, fish, or wetlands. It was a slow poisoning of human bodies and the collapse of entire societies. By the late 1970s, doctors in the Karakol-Pakstan region, south of the sea in Uzbekistan, were reporting cases that no longer fit into normal patterns. Children were arriving at hospitals with chronic respiratory problems. Women were suffering miscarriages at alarming rates. Cancers of the throat, stomach, and esophagus were becoming so common that they seemed to belong to every family. The cause was not hidden in mystery. It was carried on the wind. dissolved in drinking water, and buried in the soil. As the sea contracted, tens of thousands of square kilometers of exposed seabed released a new kind of desert into the world. Not sand, but salt crust laced with decades of agricultural chemicals. For years, the irrigation canals that siphoned off the Amu Darya and Sir Darya had been laced with fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. These toxins drained into the Aral, concentrated as the water volume fell, and were left behind when the waves retreated. By the 1980s, each dust storm carried not only salt, but also residues of DDT, hexachlorocyclohexane, and other persistent chemicals. Scientists recorded up to 43 million tons of salt and toxic dust being lifted into the air each year. What had happened that every breath carried invisible shards of poison? This was daily life in the Aral Basin. Respiratory diseases became the hallmark of the region. Chronic bronchitis and asthma soared to rates several times higher than the Soviet average. In Karakalpakstan, medical surveys from the late 1980s showed that every second child suffered from some form of respiratory illness. Tuberculosis spread aggressively, aided by weakened immune systems and poor nutrition. Cancers multiplied, especially of the lungs, throat, and digestive system, linked directly to the intake of contaminated water and food. The dust storms coated vegetables, fields, and houses in salt, and people consumed it unknowingly with every meal. Water itself, once sustained by the flow of two great rivers, had become a source of sickness. As the Sir Darya and Amu Darya dwindled into trickles before reaching the sea, the remaining water supplies turned brackish. Wells and rivers contained high levels of salinity and toxins. Villages drank from canals where pesticide residues floated visibly, carried from cotton fields upstream. Diarrheal diseases, hepatitis, and kidney problems spread, leaving entire communities dependent on failing Soviet medical infrastructure. By 1990, infant mortality in parts of Karakalpakstan had climbed to 110 deaths per 1,000 live births, among the highest in the world at the time. Many infants were born with congenital defects, cleft palates, spinal deformities, and heart problems, conditions that local doctors directly associated with toxic exposure. Socioeconomic devastation compounded the health disaster. Once thriving port towns were now abandoned landscapes where unemployment ruled. Moynak, which had supported fish canneries employing thousands, lost its economic core. Families that had lived for generations by fishing were suddenly without income, their boats rusting in fields of salt. Aralsk in Kazakhstan saw its population shrink as residents left to find work elsewhere, often moving to distant Soviet cities. Migration fractured communities, separating families that had lived in the Aral Basin for centuries. The cultural traditions tied to the sea, fishing festivals, local recipes, songs about the water, were silenced as the sea itself withdrew. Oral histories capture the weight of this loss. Residents recall the day when the shoreline vanished from sight, when children who had played at the water's edge could no longer see the waves from their homes. In Moynak, elders told researchers how the air began to taste bitter, how food grew strange, how illnesses that once were rare became constant companions. Fishermen spoke of carrying their nets across miles of desert, following the retreating sea, only to find dead fish floating in hypersaline water. Women remembered boiling tea with water, so salty it left stains on the pot. The younger generation grew up without the sea that had shaped their ancestors' lives, yet they bore the heaviest weight of its disappearance, their health permanently scarred by what they inhaled and consumed. The role of cotton in this catastrophe was impossible to ignore. Soviet planners had called it white gold, the fiber that would feed Moscow's factories and clothe the population. But for those who lived near the Aral, cotton brought something else entirely. The chemicals required to sustain monoculture in an arid desert landscape were poured in without restraint. In the late 1980s, Uzbekistan alone applied over 80 kilograms of fertilizer and pesticides per hectare, among the highest rates in the Soviet Union. The fields yielded their white harvest, but the runoff carried poisons into the rivers, into the sea, and eventually into human bloodstreams. Health workers in the region began to track rising rates of anemia, especially among women. Surveys in the 1990s revealed that 70% of women of reproductive age in Karakalpakstan were anemic, their bodies deprived of essential nutrients. Malnutrition was rampant. With the loss of fish, a primary source of protein disappeared from local diets. Dust-covered fields produced declining harvests of grain and vegetables, leaving families dependent on meager rations. Children suffered from stunted growth, their development permanently impaired by the toxic environment and lack of nutrition. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union stripped away even the limited safety nets that had existed. Hospitals were left without medicines, doctors without salaries, and patients without hope. International aid organizations that visited Karakalpakstan in the 1990s documented scenes that resembled a slow-moving epidemic. They found communities where nearly every family had lost a child, where graveyards had expanded faster than neighborhoods, where entire generations lived with chronic illnesses that no government could cure. Oral testimonies preserved not only suffering, but also the bewilderment of those who witnessed the transformation. A fisherman from Aralsk recalled how his father once brought home sturgeon so large that it took 2 men to carry them. By the late 1980s, his own children had never even seen the sea. A mother in Moynak told aid workers in 1992 that she no longer told her children stories about the sea, because to them it sounded like fantasy. What happened that a child grew up surrounded by ships, yet had never seen water touch their hulls? That was the paradox of the Aral disaster, the presence of memory without reality, of boats in the sand and seas in the past tense. The human cost of the Aral Sea's disappearance was measured not only in statistics, but also in silence, the silence of vanished industries, of villages emptied by migration, of traditions severed from the water that had sustained them. The disaster reached into lungs, bloodstreams, economies, and cultures, binding health and history together in a single tragedy. The sea had vanished, but its poisons remained, drifting through the air and circulating through the bodies of those left behind. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Aral Sea lay broken, its surface area already reduced by half, its water volume slashed to 1/3 of its former size. What had been a centralized system of command and resource management dissolved overnight into a patchwork of independent states, each inheriting both the gains and the wounds of 70 years of Soviet rule. For Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, the most visible inheritance was an environmental catastrophe on a scale so vast it reshaped not only their landscapes, but their very national destinies. The maps of Central Asia no longer carried the vast inland sea as a defining feature. Instead, they bore witness to an absence, a void stretching across thousands of square kilometers of salt and dust. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, bound by geography but divided by politics, were forced to make choices in the shadow of disaster. For Uzbekistan, the decision was clear and ruthless. Cotton, the so-called white gold, remained the foundation of the new nation's economy. Under President Islam Karimov, who consolidated power in the early 1990s, the state clung to the Soviet-era model of forced cotton cultivation. Cotton exports brought foreign currency into a fragile economy struggling to stand on its own. The Amu Darya, which once fed the Aral Sea, was still diverted through colossal canal systems, its water evaporating under desert heat before reaching its natural destination. Entire rural communities were pressed into seasonal cotton harvesting, often under conditions that international observers compared to coercive labor. The logic was merciless. The survival of the state outweighed the survival of the sea. Kazakhstan, in contrast, inherited the northern section of the Aral. Though equally scarred, its leadership under President Nursultan Nazarbayev approached the crisis differently. The port city of Aralsk, once bustling with fishing fleets, now stood stranded more than 60 kilometers from the nearest waterline. Yet in Astana, policymakers recognized that without some form of intervention, the northern Aral would vanish completely. Unlike Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan did not have the same dependence on cotton monoculture. Wheat and other grains dominated its agriculture, requiring less diversion from the Syr Darya. This difference set the stage for diverging strategies between the two nations, with Kazakhstan increasingly open to international water management projects, while Uzbekistan entrenched itself in defending cotton at all costs. International attention surged in the early 1990s. The Aral crisis, once a guarded Soviet embarrassment, was now visible to the world through satellite imagery and field reports. The World Bank, the United Nations Development Program (UNDP), and various NGOs began drafting proposals to mitigate the damage. In 1993, the 5 newly independent Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, formed the Interstate Commission for Water Coordination (ICWC), intended to manage shared rivers and prevent further catastrophe. On paper, this was a milestone. In practice, it was paralyzed by mistrust and competing national interests. What did it happen that rivers, once seen as lifelines, became instruments of political bargaining? This was the reality of Central Asia in the 1990s. Kyrgyzstan upstream wanted to use water for hydropower, releasing it in winter for electricity. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, downstream, needed it in summer for crops. Agreements broke down, promises were ignored, and the Amu Darya and Sir Darya remained contested arteries. Uzbekistan's insistence on prioritizing cotton clashed with Kazakhstan's tentative attempts to rehabilitate its northern sea. Instead of cooperation, water became a weapon of negotiation, traded for gas, oil, and electricity across a fragile regional economy. Corruption further eroded international efforts. Funds allocated by foreign donors to rehabilitate canals or improve irrigation systems often disappeared into private accounts or were siphoned off through inflated contracts. Western aid agencies documented millions of dollars lost to inefficiency or outright theft. Local officials, shaped by decades of Soviet bureaucracy, resisted reforms that threatened entrenched interests. For communities living near the Aral, promises of aid often translated into little more than surveys, workshops, or the occasional delivery of medicine, while the environmental disaster continued unabated. In Uzbekistan, Karimov's regime treated environmental activists with suspicion. Criticism of cotton policy was seen as criticism of the state itself. Reports of contaminated water and rising disease rates were downplayed or suppressed. Rural populations were compelled each year to meet cotton quotas, their labor and water resources locked in the same cycle that had drained the Aral in the first place. The state presented cotton exports as a triumph of independence, proof that Uzbekistan could sustain itself without Moscow's subsidies. But beneath this narrative, the sea vanished further, its absence expanding into the identity of the nation. Kazakhstan, meanwhile, cautiously moved toward action. In the mid-1990s, it began collaborating with the World Bank on feasibility studies for a dam to separate the northern and southern Aral. By physically dividing the smaller northern basin from the southern expanse, Kazakh planners hoped to conserve the Sir Darya's limited inflow and stabilize the northern waters. The project would take another decade to materialize, but already the contrast with Uzbekistan was striking. One state clinging to the destructive past, the other searching, however imperfectly, for solutions. For ordinary people, independence brought little relief. In Karakalpakstan, within Uzbekistan's borders, residents still breathed toxic dust and drank saline water. The collapse of the Soviet Union had stripped away subsidies, leaving hospitals underfunded and doctors unpaid. In Aral's Kazakhstan, unemployment remained widespread as the fishing industry was a memory rather than an economy. Oral testimonies from the 1990s capture this sense of abandonment. Residents spoke of leaders promising revival, of foreign delegations arriving with cameras and notebooks, yet nothing changing on the ground. The sea was gone, and independence had not brought it back. The geopolitical stakes grew sharper as years passed. Uzbekistan guarded its cotton exports fiercely, securing contracts with European textile industries and buyers in Asia. Kazakhstan courted international partners for water projects, highlighting its relative openness compared to its southern neighbor. Meanwhile, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan added their own competing demands to the fragile regional water-sharing system. Each state prioritized survival, but survival meant something different for each. Cotton for one, grain for another, electricity for a third. Cooperation was spoken of at summits, but on the ground, rivers were divided, dammed, and drained without collective oversight. By the end of the 1990s, the Aral Sea was no longer a single body of water, but a fragmented system. The northern small Aral lingered in Kazakhstan, reduced but not extinguished. The southern large Aral, within Uzbekistan, splintered into eastern and western basins, shrinking toward dust. The contrast mirrored the choices of the two nations. Kazakhstan had, at least tentatively, sought preservation. Uzbekistan had doubled down on extraction. And the world, though aware and concerned, struggled to intervene effectively against the tide of politics, corruption, and competing interests. The independence of Central Asia did not end the Aral disaster. It reshaped it into a new phase, one where national sovereignty replaced Soviet command. But the rivers kept flowing away from the sea, and the silence of the shrinking shoreline remained unbroken. In 2005, an event unfolded on the barren shores of northern Kazakhstan that many had thought impossible. The Aral Sea, or at least a fragment of it, began to return. The construction of the Koch-Aral Dam, a $85 million project jointly funded by the World Bank and the Kazakh government, marked the first serious attempt to halt decades of ecological collapse. For years, engineers and scientists had studied whether the Syr Darya, still trickling into the northern basin, could sustain a smaller, more concentrated body of water if separated from the south. The Koch-Aral Dam, stretching across 13 kilometers, was designed to do exactly that: cut off the small Aral from the dying southern basin and trap its remaining water. When the dam gates closed, the world witnessed a reversal no one had dared to expect. The northern Aral began to rise. Within months, the water level exceeded predictions. The sea surface climbed from 30 meters to 42 meters above sea level, covering ground that had been exposed for years. Old fishing harbors, once stranded kilometers inland, saw the waves creeping closer. In Aralsk and nearby villages, people who had lived their entire adult lives watching the sea retreat suddenly found it returning, not in dreams, but in measurable meters and kilometers. What had happened that a sea long pronounced dead stirred with life once again? This was the sensation in northern Kazakhstan in the years after 2005. The ecological response was immediate. Salinity, which had climbed to deadly levels during the 1980s and 1990s, fell sharply. Species of fish that had nearly vanished found conditions suitable again. The common carp, flounder, and pike perch began to reappear, aided by restocking programs. Fishermen, who had once abandoned their livelihoods, returned to the water. In the village of Tastabek, near the restored shore, families began repairing boats that had stood unused for decades. By 2006, commercial fishing was viable again in parts of the North Aral, producing thousands of tons of fish annually. The sound of nets hitting the water and the sight of fish markets reopening carried not only economic meaning but cultural significance. Life tied to the sea was no longer only a memory. For Kazakhstan, the revival of the North Aral became a rare environmental success story in a region long defined by disaster. President Nursultan Nazarbayev declared the project a national achievement, proof that independent Kazakhstan could deliver where the Soviet Union had failed. International observers hailed it as a model for regional cooperation and sustainability, though in reality it was not cooperation that saved the North Aral, it was separation. By cutting itself off from the southern basin, the northern sea was able to survive independently, no longer bleeding water into a wasteland that could not be sustained. Yet the revival carried limits that no dam could erase. The restored North Aral covered roughly 3,300 square kilometers, a fraction of the sea's former expanse. Its depth, though increased, remained shallow compared to the pre-1960 sea. Aralsk, once a proud fishing port, still lay dozens of kilometers from the water's edge, despite local hopes that the rising levels would one day bring the waves back to its harbor. The Aral Dam had given the Northern Sea stability, but not eternity. It required constant maintenance, careful management of Sea Daria inflows, and continued investment to prevent salinity from creeping upward again. The project had succeeded, but it had succeeded in saving only a remnant. The contrast with the southern Aral across the border in Uzbekistan could not have been sharper. While Kazakhstan celebrated the partial rebirth of its sea, Uzbekistan continued to prioritize cotton cultivation. The Amu Daria remained heavily diverted, its waters swallowed by desert irrigation canals that leaked and evaporated before reaching the old shoreline. The southern Aral split into eastern and western lobes, each shrinking at different rates. By 2014, satellite images showed the eastern basin had dried up entirely for the first time in recorded history. What had once been the largest part of the sea was now a salt desert known as the Aralkum, stretching thousands of square kilometers and producing toxic dust storms year after year. Communities in Uzbekistan, unlike their Kazakh counterparts, saw no return of fishing or relief from unemployment. Moynak, once the beating heart of the Aral's fishing industry, remained a graveyard of rusting ships on the sand. Residents spoke of hearing news of Kazakhstan's dam and revival, but for them it was a distant story, one that brought no water to their parched land. The Soviet irrigation legacy continued to dominate Uzbek agriculture, and cotton exports still accounted for a significant share of the national economy. For leaders in Tashkent, the sea's survival was less important than the state's revenue. The revival of the North Aral also revealed the limits of restoration. No engineer claimed the sea could be brought back to its pre-1960 size. The Aral Dam was a compromise with geography and history, a recognition that only a part of the sea could be saved. The Amu Daria was too heavily consumed by agriculture, the southern desert too vast, the salinity too high for restoration at scale. International experts described the project not as a resurrection, but as a stabilization, keeping alive what could be kept alive, letting the rest slip into history. What had happened that the definition of success in saving an inland sea became the ability to save only a fragment? That question haunted every report, every press release, every celebration. Yet for the people of northern Kazakhstan, even a fragment was life-changing. The return of fish meant the return of work. The reduction in toxic dust meant cleaner air, fewer illnesses, and healthier crops. Markets that had long depended on imported fish now stocked local catches once again. Families spoke of children who had grown up without the sea, but were now learning to fish alongside their parents. The revival was not only economic, but generational, reconnecting memory to reality. Scientists monitoring the project noted a subtle but important change in climate. The presence of the restored water body slightly moderated temperatures in the surrounding region, reducing the extremes of summer heat and winter cold. Though modest compared to the sea's former regulatory role, it was a reminder of how powerfully even a smaller Aral could influence its environment. Biodiversity also showed signs of cautious recovery, with the return of migratory birds to the wetlands forming around the stabilized shoreline. The Aral Dam became a symbol of what was possible when political will, international funding, and geographic advantage aligned. But it also stood as a reminder of what was impossible. The southern Aral continued to vanish, dragging with it entire communities, cultures, and ecosystems. Kazakhstan had shown that part of the sea could live again, but Uzbekistan had shown that the larger whole could still die. And between them, the memory of the once unified Aral Sea remained a scar on maps and in minds, its absence as vast as its former presence. The Aral Sea, once the fourth largest inland body of water on Earth, stands today as one of the clearest warnings in human history. In 1960, it stretched across 68,000 square kilometers, its blue expanse nourishing ecosystems, supporting thriving fisheries, and moderating climates across Central Asia. By the end of the 20th century, it had lost over 90% of its surface area. Few events demonstrate more brutally the cost of short-term planning than this transformation from living sea to desert wasteland. What had happened that an entire inland sea, built over millennia by rivers flowing from glaciers and highlands, could vanish within a single human lifetime. This is the lesson the Aral Sea teaches, a lesson carved not in theory, but in the dust storms and abandoned ships that remain. The story begins with the Soviet Union's ambition. In the 1950s, Moscow launched massive irrigation projects to turn the arid lands of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan into cotton fields. Cotton, white gold, promised wealth, export revenue, and geopolitical leverage. Canals such as the Karakum Canal, stretching 1,375 kilometers, diverted enormous volumes of water from the Amu Darya and Sir Darya, the lifelines of the Aral Sea. In 1960, these rivers delivered about 55 cubic kilometers of water annually into the sea. By the early 1980s, inflow had dropped to less than one-tenth of that. Soviet planners achieved their cotton harvests, but the cost was the systematic drying of one of the world's Great Lakes. This disaster was not sudden. It unfolded step by step, year after year, as shorelines receded and fishing villages were stranded. By 1977, the sea had already lost one-third of its volume. By 1989, satellite images revealed it splitting into two, the North Aral in Kazakhstan and the South Aral in Uzbekistan. Scientists declared it an ecological catastrophe, yet irrigation continued, driven by political and economic pressures. What had happened that leaders knew the sea was collapsing, but chose to keep pumping its rivers into the fields? The Aral Sea shows how short-term priorities can overrule survival itself. The human toll was immense. The fishing industry, which once produced 40,000 tons of fish annually, collapsed entirely by the 1980s. Tens of thousands of workers lost their livelihoods. Towns like Moynak in Uzbekistan and Aralsk in Kazakhstan, once vibrant ports, became ghost cities stranded in deserts of salt and dust. The drying seabed exposed layers of toxic pesticides and fertilizers accumulated over decades. Winds lifted this poisoned dust into the atmosphere, spreading across Central Asia, sometimes as far as the Caucasus and the Arctic. Respiratory illnesses, cancers, and birth defects rose sharply. Clean water became scarce, as rivers carrying agricultural runoff brought contamination instead of life. Here, the Aral Sea's lesson widened. Environmental manipulation does not stay contained in maps. It flows into bodies, into lungs, into generations. The disappearance of the Aral Sea also altered the regional climate. Without its moderating influence, summers grew hotter, winters colder. Rainfall patterns shifted, worsening desertification in the already fragile steppes and deserts of Central Asia. Farmers, who once relied on predictable seasons, found themselves battling harsher conditions. By the 1990s, much of the surrounding land had become unproductive, driving migration and economic collapse. The environmental system of Central Asia had been rewritten, not by natural forces, but by state-led diversion projects. Globally, the Aral Sea became a symbol of what unchecked human ambition could destroy. International scientists and journalists began documenting its decline in the 1980s and 1990s, calling it one of the worst human-made environmental disasters. Organizations such as the United Nations and the World Bank invested in studies and projects to mitigate the damage, yet political barriers and corruption limited their impact. Still, the Aral Sea forced the world to confront a stark question. What had happened when rivers that sustain civilizations are redirected on a continental scale? The answer lay in the maps that once showed a vast blue expanse, but by 2014 depicted only patches of water and endless desert. This collapse is more than regional history. It carries lessons for water management across the 21st century. The Aral Sea warns against large-scale diversion projects that value immediate profit over long-term survival. Today, across the globe, rivers are under pressure. In China, the Yellow River has run dry in stretches due to overuse. In the United States, the Colorado River struggles to reach the sea, its waters siphoned for agriculture and cities. In Africa, the Nile faces competing claims from Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, each project threatening to tip a fragile balance. The Aral Sea demonstrates what happens when such pressures are ignored. the transformation of rivers into tools of extraction rather than lifelines of ecosystems. The relevance of this lesson grows sharper in the age of climate change. Rising global temperatures threaten glaciers in Central Asia, the Himalayas, and the Andes, reducing the very sources of river systems. Desertification is advancing in regions already struggling with water scarcity. The temptation to replicate Soviet-style engineering projects, massive dams, canals, and diversions remain strong, but the Aral Sea shows the cost. Once a sea vanishes, no amount of money or engineering can fully bring it back. The Koch-Aral Dam of 2005 in Kazakhstan proved partial recovery is possible, but also proved limits. Only a fragment could be revived, never the whole. The lesson reaches beyond water. It is about how states, economies, and ideologies approach nature itself. The Soviet Union treated rivers as tools of command, to be redirected at will for economic goals. The result was not only environmental collapse, but cultural loss. Fishing traditions built over centuries vanished in a generation. Oral histories collected in Aralsk and Moynak describe the pain of watching the sea retreat, of children growing up never knowing the water that defined their parents' lives. The Aral Sea teaches that reshaping nature for power and profit erases cultures, as well as ecosystems. Every map of Central Asia tells this story. Compare maps from 1960 with those of today. Where once the Aral stretched vast and continuous, there is now fragmented blue, surrounded by tan emptiness. These maps are not just geography, they are records of human choices. Borders shifted after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the most dramatic border change was that of the sea itself, retreating kilometer by kilometer until entire nations were reshaped by its absence. The Aral Sea stands as a mirror for the 21st century. It reflects the dangers of choosing immediate economic gain over ecological survival, the consequences of seeing rivers as machines rather than living systems. It reflects the vulnerability of societies tied to water, the fragility of balance between human ambition and natural endurance. And it reflects the permanence of loss. Once a sea is gone, the generations who lived by it cannot be restored, their songs and livelihoods confined to memory. The lesson of the Aral is not abstract. It is a scar still visible from space, a silence still felt in abandoned ports, a storm of salt still blowing across Central Asia.